All right, everyone. This is the podcast Marc Andreessen does not want you to listen to because we are talking about psychedelic medicine and how it's a good thing, not a bad thing. And even more heretically, we're doing it in Silicon Valley, of all places. This is the Psychedelic Resistance Live. Dillan DiNardo, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I think we did a podcast 3 years ago, right after my fund invested in Mindstate Design Labs, the company that you are the founder and CEO of. And Mindstate Design Labs is doing a lot of interesting things in the field of psychedelics and consciousness. Do you want to give everyone just a quick overview of Mindstate, and then we'll jump into some other fun topics like consciousness, AI, the startup world, the macro environment, RFK, all that stuff.
All right, everything, all the good stuff. Okay, yes. So, Mindstate Design Labs, we are an AI platform and a drug development company, and we focus on novel psychoactive effects. So, very much a psychedelic research company, but using psychedelics as tools to probe the architecture of the mind. So, our goal is to map the biological basis of the varieties of psychedelic experience. So, if we can find these mechanisms by which different psychedelics cause very different effects, we can leverage those mechanisms and turn those into entirely novel psychoactive therapeutics, which may or may not be called psychedelics, depending on your definition.
Right.
Yeah,
it's interesting. And 3 years ago in 2021, when you guys went through YC, there were lots of companies in the psychedelics world, lots of new entrepreneurs starting companies. There was a lot of excitement around psychedelics. And now there have been like no new psychedelic companies started in the last 18 months, it feels like. I mean, maybe a few, but not any significant ones. The venture capital market's in a very different place than it was. The biotech market's in a very different place than it was. What have you noticed to have been like the main shifts in just like the environment in which you're operating? Maybe not, we can touch on like just the business environment in general, but then psychedelics as well.
Right. Well, I think much of the blame here is not on psychedelics themselves. I would say this is very much a macro factor, right? So this is all of biotech, and it's very much based on just, again, macro factors like interest rates, right? When interest rates go up, then any long-term bets, any kind of innovation that takes some period of years to come to fruition rather than a very simple, a SaaS company, something that gets revenue immediately, it's a very different kind of environment. So I think certainly not all of the blame belongs with psychedelics there, and we continue to see that the fundamentals, the science, right, it continues to grow. We continue to get good readouts. We continue to see good research. Our understanding of psychedelics and psychedelic mechanisms and risks and how to mitigate those risks and all these important factors is really so much better than it was 3 years ago. So that's continued to just steadily improve. But at the same time, the macro markets are where they are, and so biotech has seen a very different just cycle, cycles of layoffs and employment factors and investment and so forth. And my background's in biotech VC, and I'm not a 30-year veteran, but these cycles happen, and sure. It's just it's about riding the wave, and you can't make excuses either. Like it's hard out there for many biotech companies, but you ultimately have to focus on the science, and these times can be very helpful in helping you really narrow down and focus on what is most important, what is most transformative, and how is that connection made between the nature of your science and the transformative impact it can have on patients, right? So narrowing your vision toward what exactly is the highest impact and how can we get that to patients as quickly as possible. That's one of the benefits of these kinds of times.
Yeah, and it's not like, even though there's a lot less excitement in psychedelics today, the problems that psychedelics are trying to solve have not gotten any better. So the opportunity is just as big, right? Like the mental health crisis, all those stats that people quoted in 2021, 20% of people have a mental health crisis, 50% chance of being diagnosed in your lifetime, 16% of people on some sort of SSRI, which most people have problems with, develop severe side effects from, et cetera. Those didn't go away. Those are still realities. But there's also been like some interesting shifts in I guess you could call it politics or just like cultural views around psychedelics. And they're sort of weird, like diametrically opposing forces that kind of don't really make sense to me. So on the one hand, you have like RFK, right? And he's full on MAGA now, and he's a big proponent of psychedelics. You have like Rick Perry, governor of Texas, just went on Joe Rogan and talked about Ibogaine for 2 hours. And then very strangely, a lot of the Silicon Valley people, like Marc Andreessen being probably the primary one, but this sort of like new wave of like American dynamism pilled tech bro is like anything that is not for improving my productivity, including psychedelics, is bad. So now, whereas San Francisco used to be the home of psychedelics and it used to be about like tech CEOs microdosing, now the only thing you can do is Zins and nicotine, right? That's the only like VC startup approved drug. What do you make of like the political shift, this like cultural startup world shift? Why do you think Marc Andreessen is so opposed to psychedelics?
What happened at Burning Man to Marc Andreessen?
Yeah.
It sounds like his portfolio CEO is being one-shotted by ayahuasca.
One-shotted by the six-dimensional Mesopotamian demon. Yeah.
I think the first place to start is that I actually see this as a very encouraging sign that things are getting real. Like I think that society is actually grappling with the reality of integrating psychedelics at scale. As an investor, the metaphor I'd use is sometimes you're doing diligence on a company and you don't you're not going to invest, or maybe you'll invest, and you might gloss over certain things, and then once you decide to write that check, once it's real, once it's happening, all of a sudden you are dealing with the details of the reality of what's happening, and what the risks are and what the benefits are, and the practical integration. So I feel like that's where we are now. We had this hype wave where psychedelics were this utopia that was going to cure every mental health disorder, and every danger of psychedelics was propaganda of the drug wars of the 1960s and 70s, and now we're kind of coming to grips with the fact that these are extraordinarily powerful tools. Things can go very, very right. The efficacy of these therapeutics are so far beyond any other classes of therapeutics that we have for mental health disorders. But there are downsides, and there are risks, and there are ways to mitigate those risks. And I think that as adoption increases, both within this medical context and within other contexts as well, as you get scale, you're going to see these things that go wrong a very small percentage of the time. You're going to see those things in the headlines a bit more, and we're going to have to grapple with how do we deal with those things? How much risk do we take? I use the metaphor of automobiles, right? So automobiles are responsible for countless deaths and destruction on an annual basis, and we no one is ever talking about getting rid of cars, right? So there's some level at which you understand the risks that you're taking, you mitigate those risks, and you weigh the risks against the benefits. And so I think we're in this process of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis of pro psychedelics and anti psychedelics, and then what it actually means to have psychedelic therapy at scale in our society.
So yeah, just to kind of go back to the point you were making at the beginning, the fact that someone like Marc is even talking about it is a sign. Like if this wasn't close to being a reality, no one would bother talking about it because it's like too unlikely. Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. And you think that that's the case even with like the MAPS rejection?
Well, I would probably disclaim too many opinions on the MAPS rejection. We just don't have the complete response letters, so it's all speculative. But there are certainly. These are interesting times. It was not on my bingo card that psychedelics would become a major MAGA platform issue.
It's crazy.
It was not on my bingo card that Rick Perry would be on Rogan championing psychedelics for multiple hours. I think that is a testament to Maybe some of the strategies that early proponents of psychedelics took, and I think it's also a testament to the fact that these things are not partisan things, right? Psychedelics got very wrapped up in the culture wars of the 1960s and the counterculture, but there's no specific reason for that, right? And so
sure, there shouldn't be, but in America, we're such a stupid country. Everything's political, right? So we have to have a political opinion about the cheeseburger that you ate. Like everything has some sort of political connotation. So like, yeah, it's just been interesting. Like you would have never expected a Republican platform to be sort of pro psychedelic, or at least some wing of it. I mean, I grew up in a very like conservative, Christian environment, and the idea that any of those people would like be open to psychedelics or even like platforming them is like not something I could have ever imagined, no matter how much mushrooms I took.
Yeah.
But more seriously, though, when it comes to RFK having at least some authority in the government, you've probably studied the issue more than I have because your company like probably directly depends on what sort of regulatory changes happen in the next few years. What could someone like RFK actually do, if anything, to make the lives of people trying to get psychedelics approved by the FDA easier, or maybe less relevant to your guys' case specifically, but make psychedelics more available maybe through non-FDA regulated pathways? Is that something that you've kind of looked at deeply, or?
It's not certainly. I keep track of things. Ultimately, we're going to focus on what we can control. But yeah, that's a very relevant issue. I think first of all, what I hope is not done is a lowering of standards, right? So the FDA processes they're rigorous, they're very difficult, they're very complex. But the end result of an FDA stamp of approval is valuable, right? It shows that the compound in question has been through the process and it has the safety and that is very valuable to psychedelics themselves. And so lowering the bar there, I don't think helps.
And by lowering the bar, are you referring to some of the conversations that I've heard people having about back when the FDA was initially established, it was just safety? Like efficacy wasn't part of the process. And I've heard I don't know if RFK himself has said this, but some of the people in his camp have said maybe we should take things back to how the FDA was, where it was like, as long as you can prove that the compound's safe and maybe a little bit efficacious, but maybe not to the extent that a phase 2 and 3 would normally prove, then the drug can be marketed. Is that kind of what you're referring to in terms of lowering of standards, or are you more just referring to like an executive order, political favoritism, like we're just going to somehow make psychedelics, or at least a few psychedelics, approved?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really comment on how rhetoric might translate into actual policy and what that means and being pro or con, but I don't think there's a good path here to just saying, hey, let's just push psychedelics through even when they haven't met the same standards that all other medicines have to meet. I do think, though, that there are a number of things that could very easily be done, and maybe with the incoming administration, there are moves that could be made that would be very helpful to psychedelics. One obvious one is just funding. It seems obvious to me that the promise of psychedelics and the amount of funding coming from the federal government for psychedelics is just wildly out of sync, and so just additional resources there makes and it's been moving in that direction for a while anyway, but a harder push in that direction would make a lot of sense. There are a number of other things, such as I'd refer to the Right to Try Act, right? So removing some of the barriers there for people who have life-threatening disorders, being able to take advantage of some of these therapies that are in phase 3 trials, and that would give us a lot of useful data and solve some of this, solve the catch-22 that we're in with psychedelics, where they seem to be so effective, and we do want to get them to the people who could very, very much benefit from them, but at the same time not wanting to lower that bar in terms of quality and safety and so forth. So I think there are a lot of ways that psychedelics can be pushed forward, but not by lowering the bar, not with less rigor and robustness.
The right to try thing is very interesting. I'm sure you saw, I think it was Montana that passed like the most extreme version of right to try, where you don't have to have a terminal illness. You can just want to try anything, be healthy, and you want to try. I guess the potential downside of that is they can become sort of like a medical tax haven, for lack of a better analogy, right? Like a bunch of people go and do things in Montana for maybe less than perfectly ethical reasons. But yeah, conceptually, people should be able to try things as long as they're informed. And I guess that's part of the issue, right? Like it's hard for people that are not subject matter experts to really consent to something if they don't fully understand it.
That's true. Yeah. It's a there's no right answer, and again, it's a catch-22. You know, the right answer here is go back to 1970, and instead of relegating MDMA and psychedelics to some small nonprofits, it should have been made a global healthcare priority, and it wasn't, and so we're in the situation we are now, and it is what it is. But I think the interaction of state models with federal action and local action, I think that will be, it's unpredictable, but it will be interesting how states step up to play a role here.
Yeah, totally. I was very surprised that none of the issues or the ballot measures that California tried to pass since I've lived in California since 2017, all of them have failed, which is mind-blowing to me, given how wild California is. All right, enough of the politics stuff, I think, for now. So you guys, one of the things that's changed about Mindstate since we talked 3 years ago on the podcast is that you guys got your IND, which in layman's terms is basically the FDA saying you can start your clinical trials, and you're now in phase 1 clinical trials, and it is now public information which drug you are actually trialing.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that drug? And then we'll talk about the AI that helped pick that as the candidate and everything, but can you talk a bit about Moxie and why that's an interesting drug?
Sure.
And because I think a lot of people don't really know about it unless you're like pretty hardcore or deep down the psychedelic rabbit hole.
Right. So MSD-001 is our formulation of 5-MeO-MIPT, commonly known as, or maybe less commonly known as Moxie. So this is a tryptamine, and it is interesting in its the balance of psychoactive effects that it causes. So what we were looking for here was a way to, I'll use a software term, to A/B test combinations. So we can dive a bit deeper into the mechanisms, but the point here was to find a drug that was selective for serotonin. So many psychedelics and most psychedelics are famously promiscuous, pharmacologically speaking. So they're interacting with all of these sites across the brain, and fundamentally what the company is looking at is how these different interactions at different neurotransmitter receptors and other targets in the central nervous system interact to create different psychoactive effects. So we were looking to essentially strip down that interaction as much as possible, and Moxie was the best choice there. So this came out of these were studies done a number of years ago. So our scientific founder, Tom Ray, and Sasha Shulgin, and a number of others got together and selected a few dozen psychedelics for their qualitative distinctness. So how different were the psychoactive effects of these various psychedelics, and they picked the ones that were the most distinct from each other. And so there are a handful of psychedelics that are known as psychedelic tofus. I think this is a term that Sasha originally invented in reference to 2CD, where he would take that compound in combination with some other compound, and it would maybe enhance the first compound without bringing on a flavor of its own. So by flavor, I mean like the type of psychoactive effects. So with Moxie in particular, it is one of these fairly tofu-like psychedelics. It doesn't mean that it's harmless. It is still a serotonergic agonist, but the level of visual hallucinations is substantially below many of the other psychoactive effects. So at the clinical doses that we're talking about, you're not going to see open-eyed creative hallucinations. There tends to be enhanced. That as you take the dose up, it tends to be some of the cognitive effects and some of the tactile effects that are enhanced before the other effects are enhanced. So
you feel it in your brain and just the way you're thinking without actually seeing hallucinations. Obviously, at some level, you're going to have hallucinations. But
Right.
Interesting.
Yes. And so Moxie has been popular in research chemical circles. So there are things such as the borax combo. So this was popular on Reddit a number of years ago.
I don't know what that is. What is the borax combo?
I think it was a Reddit user. I think the name was borax of some type. But it's a combination of 3 drugs. So a tryptamine, an amphetamine, and an entactogen of some type. So the standard combination was 5-MeO-MIPT in combination with 5-MAPB and 2-FA, which is an amphetamine. And so the idea was to generate the entactogenic effects of MDMA with less of the hangover and hopefully with less of the neurotoxicity. Now this is all unverified. This is anecdotal, but that was the concept. And so it became popular as a combination. Another one was Poly. This was very popular in Burning Man in I think 2018. Another combination of 5-MeO-MIPT with some other drugs. And so in the underground and in indigenous practice, these combinations have been the norm rather than the exception, right? And so we're taking a similar approach, but much more grounded in all of the steps of the FDA process and in data. So
even going back to ayahuasca, that's a combination, right? So
exactly.
that doesn't exist by as is in nature. So you just to sort of recap. You were explaining that psychedelics produce their effects by hitting a bunch of different receptors. Obviously, most people in the psychedelics world know that 5-HT2A is sort of like the primary receptor of interest when discussing psychedelics. And you're saying that Moxie is a good base or tofu because Moxie generally hits 5-HT2A without a lot of activity at other receptors so that you can sort of isolate the effects of 2A without worrying about what may be happening in other places. And because of that gives you a lot of freedom to combine Moxie with other things that are not designed to target 2A, but are designed to target these other receptors that may modulate the effects of Moxie and allow you to much more precisely design whatever state of consciousness you might want to induce.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's basically it. So, and Moxie does interact with a number of different other serotonin subtypes, and maybe a little bit of the adrenergics and some other things, but very slightly. But it's not known exactly why different psychedelics cause different effects. It's been very well established that serotonin 2A has a prominent role to play. 5-HT1A, 5-HT2C, maybe some dopamine subtypes have maybe been implicated, but it's a really hard question for science to get its head around because there's no animal model, right? You can do the testing in the mouse and count the head twitches, but it doesn't really tell you anything about what receptor does what to consciousness, right? And so that's what we're looking to test. It's not proven out yet which serotonin subtypes and which other receptor subtypes are related to psychedelic effects or psychoactive effects in the context of psychedelics. But Moxie gives us the ability to hit serotonin and then bring in another compound in a series of combinations one by one to A/B test and to look at how those psychoactive effects change. And we have very good hypotheses about how they do so.
I'm sure. One other point that's interesting about Moxie is that unlike most other psychedelic drugs, it is not a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Can you talk a bit about, why is that? How come something like Moxie is not controlled when MDMA or psilocybin might be, or is, might be, is controlled?
Well, in 1970, with the Controlled Substances Act, it was basically a list of compounds, and it was not. If you look back at the knowledge of the time, it can be pretty entertaining how little is understood about any of these compounds, and they were just all grouped together and put on a list, and the law said these are illegal. And so at the time, then Alexander Shulgin was operating and creating new psychedelics, and so when you have that situation, when a new psychedelic is created, that brings up the question from a regulatory standpoint of what do you do, right? You can't, like, every single time a new molecule is created, add that to the list of these things are illegal. And so there's the Analog Act, which essentially says if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? So if it's structurally similar to an illegal drug, if it has similar effects to an illegal drug, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can possess it, but you can't eat it, and you can't have the intent to consume it. And so Moxie would probably fall under the Analog Act, as well as most other psychedelics that aren't explicitly scheduled. But that has the advantage from a research perspective that you don't need to have every single contract research organization and lab that you work with have a Schedule I license.
Got it. So it makes it significantly easier as a biotech or a drug developer. Got it. Because otherwise they would have to have a Schedule I license. Yeah, I went to some lab from our company that did have a Schedule I license, and they showed me the safe where they had all the Schedule I compounds. And it's like, anytime you open the safe, you have to log who opened the safe, who was in the room with the guy that opened the safe. You have to have, like, the weight of the safe before you opened it, and then how much the safe weighed afterwards, and, like, log everything that was taken out. And they come in and audit, and it's like probably a very big pain to deal with all that stuff. So it makes sense. And did the DEA make efforts but they did try to put it on the controlled substance list, right?
Yes. Yeah, that was in 2022. So this was the 5-tryptamines matter. So the DEA had just posted on the Federal Register that they were proposing the scheduling of 5 of these tryptamines, and so we were looking at multiple drugs on that list, and Moxie, of course, we were actively manufacturing and researching, and so we were in a position to be able to request a hearing. So there's an administrative process there where an administrative law judge does look at the scheduling matter. And so the long story short there is that the DEA ended up essentially backing off and referring the 5-tryptamines back to HHS. So HHS is responsible for doing an evaluation of the compound, which then goes to the DEA, which goes to the scheduling process. So that's been indefinitely postponed at this point, and at this point doesn't matter for us, given that we're in human studies, because we do have to then treat everything as if it is a Schedule I compound anyway.
Wait, why is that? Is that just
because now it's going into humans, and when a human is consuming something that could fall
on
under
yes, I see. Got it. So might as well be Schedule I in terms of the thing, right? Okay. So it not being scheduled makes the preclinical lab rat test tube work easier, but once it's in humans, right? Because then it's for human consumption. Makes sense. Very interesting. Okay. So you guys are in phase 1 trials now, which means there are people experiencing Moxie as we speak, potentially, maybe.
Potentially.
Wherever. That's exciting.
It is.
How does it feel to get to that point? It's been like longer than 3 years, really.
Yeah,
but
yeah. No, it feels a little bit surreal. It definitely feels great. It's a relatively quick timeline for getting a drug into the clinic, and so I'm definitely glad that we were able to move this quickly. A lot of people had to put in a lot of work to get us to that point. But we're very excited, and it's this is kind of the establishing a baseline study. So the real revolution happens when we start doing those combinations and showing that when we add Moxie together with this other compound, this particular state of consciousness or psychoactive effect that we predicted is actually the effect that's showing up in that controlled clinical context. And so right now it's Moxie and the neuroimaging and all of the phenomenological measures and all of the safety measures. So it definitely feels great to be like that much closer to getting these medicines to patients.
Yeah, it's been a journey for sure. So on the subject of these combination products, you guys have built this AI platform. And obviously, when we first did a podcast in 2021, obviously AI was something that was talked about to some extent. but it was not ubiquitous like it is right now. AI is everywhere. Every single company is turning into an AI company. I did a count where we've made 23 investments, and only 2 of them, when we invested, had AI like anywhere on their website or on their pitch deck. And now I think over almost half of them have like AI somewhere. You know, every company has to start talking about AI in some respects. But you guys are using AI in a way that I don't think any other company in the world is using it, to try and figure out how to map the subjective experience of some kind of altered state of consciousness back to a receptor. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also maybe talk about how the advancements in AI and things like ChatGPT, which did not exist when you guys were first starting out. I guess you probably had GPT-2, which was the predecessor. You probably had that if you wanted to download it and use it or something. But how has the recent acceleration in AI impacted the research that you guys are doing on the world of consciousness and like the psychedelic consciousness interplay research that you guys are doing?
Yeah, back in 2021, we'd have to explain what natural language processing is, before even getting to large language models, and now it's a household thing. So I think where AI really shines is when it is applied to where it's not just thrown into a problem for the sake of throwing AI into a problem, right? But where there is an existing process, where there is a set of domain expertise being applied to a problem, and where AI is actually needed in some segment of that process to solve a particular problem or to make a process more efficient. So as a bit of an overview here, our 2 data sets are pharmacological data sets, so primarily binding assays, so affinity of various psychedelic drugs against all of these different neurotransmitter subtypes in the human brain.
And just for the layperson, so what that means is like you do an experiment where you have a drug and you can then see, does this tightly bind to 5-HT2A, or maybe a different type of serotonin receptor, or maybe some other receptor that's not serotonin at all, like dopamine or something. So just a rating of how strongly each molecule might bind against all the different receptors of interest in the brain.
Exactly. Okay. Yes. And then there are all these other biological measures of function at the receptor and the downstream signaling pathways and a number of other things, but we don't have to geek out too much. But fundamentally, there's this biochemical data set of what is the molecular input layer of the human neural net. Yes. When you have these tools, these psychedelics that can very safely and very precisely engage certain combinations of neurotransmitter receptors, that lets you then see the effects on consciousness itself. And so that's that biochemical data set is one side. The other side that we're trying to connect the biochemical data to is human experience, so the subjective experience of an altered state. And this was something that was very subjective and very manual, but something that we could still do, right? So you didn't necessarily need AI to find all of these patterns. Sometimes they were just obvious, or you can use simple statistics. But I think one thing that's very interesting is the way that the semantic embedding spaces of the large language models have been able to quantify subjectivity. So you have your large language models. The large language models often are, let's say, interact with these separate models, which are semantic embedding models, which are essentially the multidimensional maps of all words' relationships to all other words. Mm-hmm. So this thing called language, this symbolic system that we use to map subjective reality and communicate subjective reality to each other, that system has been quantitatively mapped. So we were able to engage. We're able to use those semantic embedding spaces, and essentially you get this quantitative, geometric, multidimensional vector, right? Where you can do the math on language, and then you can very quantitatively relate language down to the biochemical. And so there is this data set of trip reports. So at this stage, we've continued to build on the database of trip reports. There are tens of thousands of trip reports
and these
now.
are just, sorry to interrupt, but these are
Yes.
just the trip reports that like Reddit users and blue light users upload after having their own experiences, right?
Yeah, that'd be one source, and we've Tom manually combed all of the books on psychedelics and transcribed all trip reports, essentially. Some are direct submissions. There are various sources, but yeah, that's exactly it. So there's this kind of, I'd call it a subculture within the psychedelic subculture of people who like to experiment with the more exotic varieties of psychedelics, and the motivation is to explore consciousness and to be some of the first ones to know how does this new chemical structure change consciousness in interesting ways that are maybe different from the well-known psychedelics. And people will record it often in very great detail, the exact time course, the route of administration, there's demographic data, there's all of these subjective effects, and so you have this huge data set of the input and the output. So the input of the molecular level of the human neural net, and the output of what is the specific change to consciousness that happens when that combination of neurotransmitters is engaged. And so that's putting AI in between allows us to quantify those relationships. So at this point.
Yeah. And I guess like the very basic level that doesn't even involve AI would be like, okay, psilocybin, which hits 5-HT2A, that's going to end up with a bunch of trip reports that probably have the word like introspection or fractal in them or something, right? This is just like word counts, not even really AI, just like here's a list of keywords. Let's see how many times these appear in the reports. And then MDMA, which is like a SERT inhibitor, or whatever. I'm not exactly sure. That's going to have a bunch of empathy words. That word is going to stand out. You guys are doing something much more advanced than that. And you can figure out these much more precise, like they're not even sentences, but they're like vectors in some weird like space that can't really be understood by humans, but that is like geographically separate from this like semantic space that maybe psilocybin has. And you can see in very interesting ways how these drugs are different, how they're similar, and what type of like subjective effects one could have. I'm sure that you could probably eventually get to something where you could have some sort of like fine-tuned ChatGPT basically tell you, like write what like the median experience of MDMA or some exotic drug, or maybe even a drug that hasn't been synthesized and consumed by humans would be, based on what its theoretical receptor binding might be.
Yes.
That's
what
cool,
we have now. Yeah.
Right? Okay, you have it now. Oh, amazing. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what are some, I know we did sort of touch on this in like the last podcast, but it's such a fascinating subject. Like, what are some of these interesting states that you guys have observed or quantified or like identified in the universe of possible altered states of consciousness?
Well, we have several systems of categorization. And this was actually a really major focus of the company in the early days, extending the borders of language, right? Articulating the ineffable, because if you can't label something and talk about it, you can't measure it. So we have various ontologies and categories of all of these wild psychoactive effects. And so some of those ontologies are manual. And so if you're familiar with the subjective effect index that Josie Kins has been working on for quite a while, that was a large piece of the manual portion of those ontologies. And so you see all kinds of crazy effects. There's I don't know, what are some of the craziest ones? Environmental cubism. So there's this rare visual effect where everything turns Picasso-like.
Really? And what can you share, like what receptors or what drugs you think are responsible for something like that?
Not off the top of my head. It's not one that's particularly therapeutically relevant. I haven't focused on that.
It's a treatment for a rare psychiatric condition where everything is circular and you need it to be more angular.
Perhaps. Yeah, so you get these crazy kinds of effects like that. I think one thing that is interesting is just the overall pattern that as psychedelics interact with more receptors. So if you take DMT, for example, which is one of it has the broadest activity across receptors, you tend to get more and more unique and exotic effects. And as you compress the range of pharmacological interactions, psychedelics get more and more boring as a general trend. So these drugs that we all know about, the ones that are popular, the LSD and DMT and so forth, tends to be the ones that are more complex and have all these crazy effects, and the ones that aren't,
they're very promiscuous on a receptor level.
That is the hypothesis. Right. Yes.
And
that's what the data looks like. So You're asking about interesting effects, and you're asking about therapeutic effects as well. So I'd say that there are targets and there are anti-targets from this perspective. So maybe the environmental cubism is an anti-target, and hallucinations in general don't necessarily tend to be helpful from a therapeutic perspective. They may increase the chances of adverse events. They make the treatment less accessible. You have a lot of cognitive or emotionally based effects that may be very helpful for therapeutics. So some things that, some effects where there is pretty good data would be effects that are already associated with psilocybin or MDMA or some of these other first-generation psychedelics that have actually been measured and linked to treatment outcomes. And so psilocybin is famous for this mystical experience. We spend a lot of time getting at a much more nuanced level at these different effects. So rather than, say, the MEQ30, which has a few subfactors of what constitutes a mystical experience, we're going down to a much more fine-grained level. And it's interesting sometimes to see reports, for example, where people will experience ego loss, so loss of this sense that they are a separate entity from the rest of the environment, but not experience a loss of contact with the environment. Typically, those two things go together. So you see these ways in which these effects can potentially separate.
So you're saying normally, if you have ego loss, you lose contact with the environment,
right.
Which is, that part is maybe not therapeutically beneficial, losing contact with the environment. So potentially you could separate those out and just have the ego loss, but not have the panic that's associated with not knowing where you are, or
right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, as one of many examples. And then as we were talking about there's this bottom up approach of building the ontology manually and grabbing all of the validated rating scales and putting those together. And then there's the top down approach of just leveraging the semantic embedding spaces of either the large language models or our own custom semantic embedding spaces to create natural forms, essentially. So letting the AI tell us, okay, what is the structure of all human experience when taking psychedelics at the most fine-grained level? And you can see you can map out the entire tree from the single node of any subjective effect down to the major categories, and then all of these individual words and phrases that people use to describe all of the subfactors in all of the subcategories.
Yeah, that's a pretty big tree, I would imagine.
Yes.
Very large tree of possibility. Hard to think about what to say from there, because that's quite a bit. I mean, in terms of, I'm trying to think here. It's a lot that could be said. So what do you think this tells us about consciousness? I know that's a very kind of broad question, but knowing that one can like manipulate these states and have like therapeutic benefit come from that, does that tell us anything about consciousness, or is this just like, adjusting the color on the TV, which doesn't really change like fundamentally what's going on in a television, right? It's just like adjusting the perception of what's happening.
Yeah. It's mystifying to me that more people aren't obsessed with this particular question and this particular route of inquiry, right? The use of psychedelics to and the mapping of psychedelics and the biochemical basis of psychedelics to consciousness itself, because it just seems that this is easily the most concrete and the most practical way to make immediate short-term progress on our understanding of the mechanisms of consciousness. So you have these drugs that engage all of these different targets in very specific ways, and it's like it's breaking the clock apart and seeing the mechanisms within, but you can do this in such a targeted way and such a safe way. And so I think this is certainly part of the long-term tech tree for us, right? And the key mission of the company is mapping the biological basis of consciousness, and the technology that immediately and naturally flows from that is the ability to design psychoactive effects, because you understand the biology that's relevant. Longer term, then there are all kinds of other potential applications, but this is just such a practical way to examine how consciousness works.
Yeah, and I guess obviously you're focused on psychedelic drugs and small molecules, maybe more generally as your tool to probe consciousness at the moment. But do you think that whether it's Mindstate design or just in general, is there room for things like genetic medicine, for things like neuromodulation and focused ultrasound and electrostimulation, that sort of thing? Does that, I assume that world overlaps with the work that Mindstate is doing. To what extent do you think it's important to like take into account those other methods of probing the brain or modulating the brain when doing this research?
Right. Well, with things like genetics, that's certainly a big part of the clinical trials where we're collecting this information, and that will ultimately lead to more personalized therapies. I think then with things like neurostimulation, and there are all kinds of associated technologies, there are benefits and drawbacks to all of these ways of kind of disrupting the brain's entrenched connectivity, right? And so I think there's building the map, and then there's navigating in the space, right? And so in the building of the map, psychedelics let you build the map in a way that is intersubjective, right? You can go across people with the same drugs, and so there's some level of standardization, and there's a level of detail that you're not going to necessarily be able to get with the neurostimulation, because you're looking at the receptor populations across the brain and not necessarily at a geographic region within the brain. So that's building the map, and then in navigating the map, right, in inducing a specific psychoactive effect or state of consciousness. I think that this particular approach we're taking to have the serotonergic agonist that disrupts the network connectivity, and then to bring in some other pharmacology that is a targeted reintegration of the brain's network. I think that is the most specificity we're going to get in the short term. In the medium term, certainly, targeted neurostimulation is probably going to be a big part of things. And as we get into brain-computer interfaces, then once we've created the map, the BCIs give us the ability to get even further resolution on the map. And if everyone is walking around with a BCI implant, then that makes inducing various states much easier, which brings up a lot of regulatory questions.
Sure. It's only a matter of time, I'm sure. Hopefully, we have 4 BCI investments, so that's the future that we're aiming towards. What I was going to ask was, you mentioned this phrase like targeted reintegration. This brings up sort of a question of like, from a purely therapeutic perspective of trying to treat a diagnosed mental health issue. There's a lot of critique of like this chemical imbalance theory, where people are like, the reason that I'm depressed is because I have low serotonin, so I have to take an SSRI because that's going to fix my serotonin problem, and then I will be happy. Obviously, because psychedelics are unique in that their effect lasts much longer than the time that the drug is active in the body. That suggests that maybe they're doing something to fix like the chemical imbalance, if there is any. Or maybe they're just allowing networks to be reintegrated into like a more proper state. This is a very clumsy way of asking, like, what do you think causes these mental health issues? And why do you think psychedelics work to fix them? Because I feel like that's sort of an important question to have an answer to before one tries to fix things with whether it's SSRIs or psychedelics.
Right. I think neuroplasticity is the new chemical imbalance. It's this like word you throw at everything, and it's fairly meaningless. Neuroplasticity means so many different things in different contexts, and I mean this conversation is inducing neuroplasticity, and so does watching TV or doing meth or like anything, right? Neuroplasticity it is not particularly meaningful, although it's certainly involved, right? So it's I think most people would agree that this is a multi-scale mechanism of action. So you have mechanisms of action at the pharmacological level, at the cellular level, with the neuroplasticity that's happening at the tissue level with the reorganization of the brain's networks of connectivity, and then there's this psychological element, which is certainly playing a big role as well. And so this question of how do you extract out one piece of that is not necessarily a question that's interesting to me, because I just don't think that will work. I think what's much more interesting is mapping between those things. I think over and over again on an anecdotal basis, both in our trip reports and when I just talk to people whose lives have been changed for the better by psychedelics, it's never a story about how it's not direct. It's not psychedelics made me happy and that cured my depression. It's I took psychedelics and I looked at the mirror and I saw in the mirror my father who abandoned me. And I had this realization that I am not my father. And from that point on, I was this deep-seated loneliness that I didn't even realize was there, disappeared. This is not my story, but just an example.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So it's always this. Loneliness is one example. It's always these things that are underneath the diagnosis, right? These diagnoses exist for diagnostic and insurance purposes, and ultimately they, two people with one particular diagnosis may not share any symptoms in common whatsoever, right? And so getting to the root of the problem is something that apparently only psychedelics and related technologies do. Sometimes you may be able to intervene at only one level of that multi-scale mechanism. Maybe there is truly a chemical imbalance, right? And SSRIs can work very well for people, but ultimately for these deep-seated mental health disorders and ultimately, the only way to have a true disease-modifying therapy is to get to the root of the issue. And so this mechanistic question is a key question, and it's one many great labs across the world are doing great research here, and ultimately we do need to understand that. But I don't think there's a simple answer because this is such a complex question. It's the higher order brain structures that humans have interacting with the environment, interacting with consciousness, and who knows what that all means.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, it's like there are some things where it's like so obvious what the cause of the problem is. Like, why is this person anxious? It's because they just lost their job and they have a kid to feed. Like, of course they're anxious. You know what I mean? Right. And then on the other hand, you have someone who has no reason to have any problems, but they're schizophrenic. And like, why is that? Is it possible that psychedelics and these types of things can fix both of these types of problems? One of the things that is quite interesting to me is the idea of people always talk about, like default mode network and this and that can fix things like depression and anxiety. But when you get to these like more hardcore mental illnesses, I do wonder if modulating the brain via psychedelics or, focused ultrasound stimulation or something like that can really make a difference there. Because on the one level, it seems like kind of crazy to even suggest giving someone who's schizophrenic, a hardcore psychedelic drug. On the other hand, both of those disorders are happening in the brain. It's the same piece of hardware that is causing both of those feelings. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on these more like intense mental health issues and if they might be potentially treated by these types of treatments or no?
Yeah, I think there are many examples, both, anecdotal certainly, and even in the clinic of these really deep-seated, really complex disorders just like vanishing in an instant with the administration of psychedelics. So that does happen. It's
even
also
things like schizophrenia, or are you talking about more like just extreme suicidality and depression, or?
So typically, mental health disorders are seen in two major clusters. There's the cluster of schizophrenia and bipolar, and essentially areas in which there's too much entropy in the brain. Yeah. And then the obsessive disorders, the phobias, the compulsive disorders, the addictions, the depression, anxiety, PTSD. That end of things is associated with more rigidity in the brain. So I was talking not about schizophrenia, but about the collection of disorders that psychedelics are exploring. Although it's very interesting to look at whether in our data sets there are patterns where schizophrenic subjective effects show up, and certain subtypes of neurotransmitters are related to those schizophrenic subjective effects that occasionally emerge in psychedelics. And so perhaps if you figure out the mechanism of psychedelics, do the reverse, and maybe you can help cure schizophrenia. But I think One thing I do want to caution against is like, yes, there are so many stories of these the miracle cures, right? It's disease modifying, it's immediate, it's enduring, and the person is just no longer has the disorder. But we also can't treat mental health as if you can just throw a magic pill at it and it's all better, right? There's so much more is important if you don't address the underlying circumstances, and if there's not a community and an ecology of practices and just physical resources that people need. It's not like the drug is just going to be this utopian, cure all for everything.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, you said you're kind of amazed that more people are not obsessed with trying to understand consciousness. And I feel like part of the reason for that is that it seems like a not very practical thing to be obsessed with, right? Like someone's like, well, that's, the kids in their dorm room at 4 a.m., they can talk about that. Yeah. But I have things to do. And what am I supposed to do if I understand like the origins of consciousness? Maybe to help make people more excited. Tell me, if we do actually crack this code, what is the world going to look like? And why, like, what can we actually do with that knowledge?
Well, I mean that's the probably the greatest mystery there is. What is consciousness? And that's above my pay grade, and no one even agrees on a definition of what we're looking at there. But the one thing that I'm very specifically confused as to why more people aren't interested is the method, the approach, the technology of taking psychedelics and examining the biological differences of psychedelic interactions and mapping that to the differences in subjective experience the different psychedelics cause. Because we have this map of physics, we have this map of consciousness, and you can put them together. You can put AI in between, and why I can't think of any other research approach that would result in more concrete progress there. But I think the end game here is well, for us specifically, it's this portfolio of states of consciousness that can be induced with a high degree of reliability, a high degree of safety. And if you have that ability to, in a regulated environment with the proper kind of therapeutic support and medical support, induce those states of consciousness that are profoundly impactful and disease modifying, then that changes all of mental health, certainly. And if you can provide people with the insights and the conviction and the courage to make the hard changes in the day-to-day that need to be changed in their lives, then it can just be the most powerful tool we've ever had for mental health.
Yeah, that makes sense. There have been some people historically who have been interested in that question. I know we wanted to talk about the Shulgin legacy and Tom Ray. Do you want to talk a little bit about, to explain to people that are not familiar with them, like what they were doing research-wise and how that sort of led to Mindstate?
Yes.
And how you're sort of continuing that tradition.
So Alexander or Sasha Shulgin and Anne Shulgin are known as the godparents of psychedelics,
yeah.
and they are responsible for introducing most existing psychedelics into the world. So this was a number of decades ago, 80s and 90s primarily, where they would Sasha, who was the chemist, would create these new compounds, do a sort of dose response study on himself, and titrate up the dose and report on what the effects were. As the effects became interesting, he would then share with Anne and a circle of friends, and so this was kind of how psychedelics came to be. And so we certainly, and much of psychedelics owes where it is to the Shulgins, who were the original tool makers. And that's what Sasha used to say, that his fundamental drive, his fundamental motivation was one of a tool maker. He said, I am creating tools for studying the mind, and other people will come and look at how those tools interact between the mind and the brain. And so that was his motivation in that, and we're one small part of that legacy. And I think that's certainly part of what inspires all of us in Mindstate Design Labs is the just the courage and the sheer gumption to just try new drugs on your body for the first time and just see what happens. So it's amazing that there are people like that.
And then Tom Ray, who was involved in that crew as well. He's done a lot of interesting research in the AI world, or at least did a lot of interesting research in the AI world. And you've mentioned before that he created the first instance of artificial life, or more specifically, one of the first computer simulations of life, right? And how does that play into the work that Mindstate is doing? Because it's sort of, in some ways, Mindstate's work is sort of furthering that same goal, I think, right? And this sort of ties into what we've talked about, where you think that maybe the research that Mindstate's doing could, eventually, maybe not today, but help inspire ways to create better like AI models.
Right. Yeah. So Tom has a long and fascinating career making seminal contributions to multiple fields of science, and he's most famous for it. So the computer program did have all of the qualifications for being listed as self-evolving life. So, but that was one thing that he's very famous for. He was the friends and collaborators with the Shulgins, of course, and what he kind of brought that they didn't have was the assays, right? So gathering that biochemical data. Once the human genome was sequenced, we had all these additional tools. So Tom's contribution was in taking much of that data and beginning to draw these connections between biology and consciousness and psychoactive effects. And so. Yes, one of the long-term outcomes here is being able to design consciousness in humans for these therapeutic purposes. But if you are learning the mechanisms of consciousness along the way, one thought is you can then take those mechanisms and perhaps that turns around and inspires new architectures of frontier AI models. So it depends on who you ask. Perhaps all AI needs at this point is just more data. Perhaps we don't need any architecture changes, and we just get to AGI with the current approach. But I think ultimately, the more we understand consciousness, there's obviously there are all these interconnected threads here. Every time a new AI model comes out, people are talking about, is this conscious, and what does it mean to be conscious? And I think the only way you'll ever know, you can't ask the machine if it's conscious and just get a yes or no answer and go on that, right? The only way you will know if the machine is conscious is by understanding the mechanisms in humans and comparing the mechanisms in humans to the mechanisms in the machine and doing the interpretability to understand both and make that connection. And so that's sci-fi. That's a long-term implication. But yeah,
but I think like seriously though, there's AGI and consciousness are not the same thing. Like you could have AGI that is not conscious, right? It just has to be generally intelligent, able to improve itself, surpass humans on, pretty much any task that a human might need to do. Consciousness is an entirely different thing, right? Like creating artificial consciousness doesn't necessarily mean that it's like an AGI god, right? That you create. So in some ways, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I think that you guys were already somewhat down this path of creating what could be considered artificial consciousness. I don't know if anyone's really defined what that actually means, but the fact that you guys have a model that is at least starting to be able to tell you what happens when these various receptors are modulated in various ways, that's probably closer to anything that I could think of that could be potentially considered like artificial consciousness. So
yeah.
You guys have probably done like step 1 of 100 towards creating artificial consciousness,
right?
But no one else has even gotten there. So,
and I know what steps 3, 4, and 5 are after that.
Okay.
Who knows?
Well,
but
you can ask the AI. It might be able to tell you.
if you have a consciousness simulator, if you have the inputs and the outputs, and you use AI to connect the two, can you then do interpretability on the AI and look inside the black box and see what the mechanisms are that are connecting the inputs and the outputs, and perhaps that inspires some computational design principles. And I don't think like C-3PO isn't coming, in the next few years, or the Terminator. I don't think that's what it looks like. I think fundamentally we'll probably start understanding consciousness in more of a piecemeal way, and step by step that will perhaps inspire improvements on the AI side.
Yeah, this. One thing I was going to ask that we didn't talk about before, have you looked at any of these companies that are doing biological compute?
Not too much. I
Yeah.
know that it's going on, and the leaders in the AI world are always arguing over what the best architecture is going to be, and how this particular approach will overcome the last approach. The track record of biology contributing to AI in recent years has
track record,
been very poor.
But I will say that in like 2023, I basically saw 0 companies that were claiming to like throw away CPUs and just have like some lab grown neurons that could control stuff. Now I've seen like 4 or 5 companies in the last year that are doing serious work on that. And obviously that is a kind of horrifying, but very interesting prospect. I remember I was listening to a podcast with this guy who had a company that was doing that. And the interviewer said like, what do you do if, the thing starts getting out of hand or starts like, becoming too powerful or something? And he literally said, like, not even trying to joke, he's like, well, there's not much that like a petri dish full of neurons can do against a gallon of bleach. And I was like, that is so bleak.
Yikes.
Like, perform the task so you get the bleach.
Yeah, there's so many ethical dimensions there, and if you actually step back and think about what are the implications of being responsible for consciousness, like that's a terrifying responsibility.
It is. It really is. Yeah. Dylan, I think I am out of questions. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, that was a lot of fun. Awesome. Talked about all my favorite things, and cool. Appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thanks so much, Dylan. Where can people find you guys online?
Mindstate.design.
Awesome. Thanks, Dylan.